SADD Nation, and welcome to another Webcast Wednesday, a part of our Super Safe Summer Fighting 100 Deadly Days campaign. My name is Carrie Ferguson, and I'm the state coordinator for our Colorado SADD. Our topic this week is marijuana use and impaired driving, and our guest today is Corporal Nicholas Hazlett with the Colorado State Patrol. Welcome, Corporal Hazlett. Thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
As we're chatting with Corporal Hazlett, feel free to throw any questions into the chat or into the comments below, and we'll get them answered either during the Q&A or afterwards. So, Corporal Hazlett, to get things started, would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
For sure. My name's Nicholas Hazlett. I've been with Colorado State Patrol for 12 and a half years. I started off in 2008, so if you do the numbers and the math, it'll get you all the way back to that date. I'm in my fourth duty assignment with the Colorado State Patrol. I spent my first 4 years up in the mountains, 4 years here in Colorado Springs, 2 years up at the Capitol in the Governor's Executive Security Unit. And then I've been back down here in Colorado Springs since the very beginning of 2018. I am currently a drug recognition expert instructor and course manager for the state of Colorado, where I teach all different levels of impaired driving classes to law enforcement officers around the state, and also outside the state around the U.S. I've been invited to a couple other states as well. I'm currently a team supervisor here in Colorado Springs with a great group of troopers that are out there working right now. I can literally hear them in my ear. So it's a blessing to be able to work for those guys. It's just a little bit about me, other than the occupational thing. I enjoy the same things that everybody else does in life. I enjoy camping and bike riding and hanging out with my kids and my wife. So that's me in a nutshell.
Thank you, Corporal, for sharing that with us, and thanks for speaking with us today. My name is Dylan Ivey, and I'm from Louisiana. I'm the Louisiana SADD State Coordinator. And the first question is, what is D.R.E? What does it stand for? Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Dylan, that's a great question. A D.R.E is a drug recognition expert. And a drug recognition expert is, let's go back a couple steps. Most officers, when they come out of the academy, they go through their basic SFSTs, which is the standardized field sobriety tests. And that's the 3-test battery where we look at their eyes, the walk and turn, and the one-leg stand. To get more advanced, there's also there's also A.R.E certification, which is the Advanced Road Size and Impaired Driving Education, where that is the DUI officer's first experience into the 7 drug categories that a D.R.E operates with. And then the final tier of that impaired driving education is to become a drug recognition expert. And what that does, Dylan, is that we can put subjects that are under the influence of a substance, be it known or unknown, and make a determination on what drug category or categories they're on through an evaluation that lasts about 45 minutes to an hour, depending on the impairment of the subject. The D.R.E really is brought in on the DUI cases because we know that other than alcohol, there's many other substances out there, many in our own homes underneath the kitchen sink that we could probably get impaired by. And people will operate their cars, unfortunately, under the influence of many different substances. But with all those substances, we have 7 categories that can categorize all those, from the central nervous system depressants, central nervous system stimulants, inhalants, narcotic analgesics, hallucinogens, cannabis, and through that evaluation, we can tell what category of drug subjects are under the influence of. So less than 1% of all law enforcement officers will ever carry the certification of a D.R.E. So it's kind of elite.
Well, thank you for demystifying a little bit about what D.R.E is. My name's Kevin, and I'm with the California SADD team. And we've noticed that Colorado and several other states have legalized recreational marijuana. Are you noticing any differences in attitudes towards this drug? And what else do you just tend to notice on the road these days?
Oh, for sure. Kevin, thank you for the question. I really appreciate it. When I first started in law enforcement as a state trooper, was the year before medicinal marijuana hit our roads, and that was in 2009. I remember when the first medicinal shop popped up. It was like there's a marijuana store in our town. It was the little tiny town of Glenwood Springs. And we know that people have recreationally used cannabis in an illicit setting for a very, very long time. Now, with it actually being legally grown at the time for medicinal purposes, for red cards and whatnot here in Colorado, it became a little bit more prevalent. And then it got through legislation to where it became recreational and decriminalized and now legal in the state of Colorado. With anything that has an impairing substance like that, especially that has a following, if you will, as well. If you look over the last couple of years, every year downtown they have a big cannabis festival downtown, and right at 4:20 p.m. everybody lights up, and there's this massive plume that rises over the heart of downtown Denver. Dylan, to kind of associate what we see as far as the mindset and the approach to cannabis, we've been attacking drunk driving with alcohol for decades, and we have great traction with going after impaired drivers, specifically those that are under the influence of alcohol. We have bars left and right in all of our big cities, and we don't have bars for cannabis yet, but these trends are coming. So we have the societal, the generally socially unacceptable approach that DUI, or the driving under the influence of alcohol, is bad, and society knows it's bad. But then now we have a legal substance, right? Cannabis is now legal. The attitudes and beliefs on the substance vary. In the last couple of years, I've been able to work with SADD, which is the Colorado Department of Transportation here, Kevin. And we've started this campaign about joining the cannabis conversation, and everybody's invited to the table. The media, the cannabis industry themselves, law enforcement, the Department of Transportation that try to keep our roadways safe. And we've opened up an open conversation and dialogue, bringing people in on the conversation of what does this drug do to us. And the industry, the cannabis industry, is now on board with the safety message that people should not drive high. So the way that it's kind of lays out still right now is that, as we know that DUI on alcohol is still socially unacceptable, and nobody's going to say that it is, the attitudes and the belief on driving under the influence of cannabis still kind of vary. So really, we're just asking, my invitation when I've been interviewed in the media is, my invitation to you, if you were to smoke cannabis, is to be honest with yourself. Don't try to lie to yourself and say I'm fine. Recognize when you're not. And obviously, for our target audience here of young people, your brain's still developing at such a young age, and the last thing we want to do is put a chemical in there, be it cannabis or alcohol or any substance, that's going to stunt or prevent the natural development of your brain. So does that answer your question, Kevin?
Yeah, it does. Definitely. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, hi, I'm Michelle. I'm the state coordinator in Arizona. I'm kind of going back to Dylan's question. Why aren't all officers DREs?
So as we started off, when Dylan was asking about what a D.R.E. is, the D.R.E. program started in 1979, and the training is very, very extensive. The SFST DUI class is a 24-hour class. It's 3 days in a wet lab, and you have the fundamental tools to go out there and investigate impaired drivers. And the basic SFSTs pick up on impaired drivers, period. Not just on alcohol, but impaired drivers. So when the majority of people that are DUI certified for SFSTs or A-RIDE certified, when they recognize that there's something wrong, there's an impairing substance going on here, and I don't know what it is, that's when they bring in, they call a D.R.E. out to come do an evaluation on the subject. The classroom training portion for the drug recognition expert school itself is 2 weeks long. The certification process thereafter is about 6 months long. After the classroom portion for a DRE, you have to have 12 enforcement evaluations or field evaluations on subjects under the influence of drugs, and you have to have more than 3 drug categories as well. After the evaluation, the DRE has to make a call on what drug category or categories they're on, and it has to be backed up by toxicology, which they often don't have right there, when they're testing the subject. They send the blood off, they get it back a couple weeks, and they have to accurately call those categories. The D.R.E. program, I've been a D.R.E. for 10 years this year, it was easily the most difficult course I've ever taken in my life. It is combining the medical field, the law enforcement field, science, research, physiology, how drugs, like symptomology and everything else in the body, and how the body reacts to different substances. Honestly, with being a part of the law enforcement community, a lot of people are intimidated, a lot of officers are intimidated by the amount of work that it takes to go into becoming a DRE. And it's a lot of work to maintain as well, because you have to recertify every 2 years, showing your work over you have minimums that you have to evaluate and accurately call and still maintain the standards. After the 12 field evals, there's a final knowledge exam, not to include the final exam at the end of the course. There's a final knowledge exam after you've been out of that class for 6 months. And it's probably the most daunting test, and it's the only one of its kind in law enforcement that I know of. There's probably others out there, but there's 5 tests, and they're cumulative. In order to get to the second one, you have to pass the first one perfectly. To get the third, you have to pass the second perfectly. You can't have errors in this, because we're dealing with substances that have a lot of knowns, and you really have to know your stuff. So within the community of law enforcement, when a DRE, when they're approached to ask to see who wants to become a DRE, everybody knows this is a really difficult course to get through. And being an instructor in it and teaching it, we try to, as the instructors, we try to make it as relatable as possible and break it down. And really, the day of training with the candidates and the officers in training doesn't really stop at 5 o'clock. Oftentimes we'll go eat dinner, change clothes, and sit back down for another several hours every day of training, just to help the students understand it. So it's a lot of work. That's probably why.
Thank you for that. So when you're out patrolling, what makes you decide to pull someone over, and what leads you to suspect that maybe they are impaired, they're driving impaired,
Sure.
And marijuana impaired specifically?
So obviously we know, everybody here knows that we can get stopped for speeding, right? That's still the number one reason why people get pulled over for a traffic violation, is primarily speeding. There was a recent California 2-year study done on cannabis cases, and the number one violation that they were pulled over for was speeding, 24% of the time. In that 2-year study, 23% of the time was lane positioning, which could be weaving outside the lane, and then 13% was disobeying traffic signals or traffic signs. That could be anything from like blowing a stop sign or going through a red light. Unsafe lane changes were at 8.7%. Crashing was 8.3%, and this is just in the California 2-year study. Driving too slowly and driving without headlights. If you think about how simple of a task it is to get into our car, turn it on, and have to remember all the little things that we have to operate to be safe on the road. It's dark. Oh, okay. I'm going to have to turn my headlights on. Obviously, as human beings, we're being engineered out of the cars. A lot of the newer vehicles have an auto light on them now, but that doesn't take away from everything else. So, when we're out there patrolling, and really what we're out there looking for is unsafe driving behavior, and we're out there trying to change that. So when we're making those traffic stops for speeding or lane violations, traffic signals or signs, unsafe lane changes, following too closely, things like that, oftentimes those are the things that they're the things we're looking for to keep people safe on the road, and they're the things that we look for impaired driving as well. So you stop somebody, and then the traffic stop can go from there. And there was another
Hi, Corporal. I'm Joey Burke.
Hi, Ms. Burke.
And talking to people who are pro-marijuana, there's a couple statements that are always said, and I'm just curious if they're true. One is that it's safer to drive under the influence of marijuana than to drunk drive. And the other one is that they drive better under the influence of marijuana.
Sure.
Could you address those?
Absolutely. So we are still doing a significant amount of research around the US and around the globe on the effects of driving under the influence of cannabis. As we talked earlier, we know that there's the common approach, social approach to DUI driving with alcohol is bad. We know that. When I was mentioning about the joining the cannabis conversation, the cannabis industry itself, because they have their interest as well and their customer base interest as well, they want to keep them safe as well. And we hear that all the time. I drive better when I'm stoned. I'm slower and I'm safer. Of course, it's better to go slower than it is to speed. However, when they're driving slower, that doesn't mean that their reaction times are better. It's actually worse. So just because they're driving slower doesn't mean they're safer. If a threat pops out into the road and you have to react to it, and whatever it is, like a high-speed lane change or an avoidance maneuver to get out of the way, the impaired brain is slower as well, not just by the speed of the car, but it's the brain that controls, it's the central nervous system that controls these. I would lift my boots up, these things that have the gas and the brake, the skinny pedal on the right and the little wide one on the left. And we have all these tasks to take care of in a vehicle, but the impaired brain that's slowed down, that is more relaxed, being more relaxed behind the wheel is not a safe thing. We need to be alert when we're operating a vehicle. So the cannabis industry has also come around to recognize that they want to keep their customers safe. And we're trying to shift that dynamic of I'm safer if I'm stoned. Are you safer if you're stoned versus if you're drunk? I would say that the only way that we should safely operate our vehicles is when we're sober. We should not be impaired at all by any substance. So be it cannabis, which is the primary context of our conversation today, be it cannabis, be it alcohol, be it cocaine, heroin, prescription drugs, whatever it is, if we're impaired, we should have no business behind the wheel of a car. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. But I have another question. So if an officer has pulled over someone and they're pretty sure that they're under the influence of marijuana and driving, what happens after that?
That's a great question. So I gave you that list of reasons that people get pulled over, right? So if I stopped a vehicle for speeding and I got up there and I smelled the odor of burnt marijuana coming from the car and I started seeing general indicators like dilated pupils, bloodshot eyes, fumbling documents, when they drop things. If I ask them, for their license, registration, and insurance, and while they're reaching for it, I ask them where they're coming from, and now they've just forgotten that they were just reaching for the registration and the insurance, their attention might be divided as well. And that's part of what the next process would be. So hold on to that in your mind. So as we see all these little tiny things being put together, not just the reason for the stop and not without it, but all the little things as well. Are there marijuana roaches in the cup holder? Is there a pipe underneath their leg that's burning them because they didn't get it out in time? Things that we've seen they happen. So if we become suspicious of this, then what I would do is, and most officers would do the very same thing, is ask them out of the vehicle to ask them further questions. Once they're no longer in control of the car, that's when I ask them how much they've had to smoke, when they last had something to smoke. And then I would ask them if they'd be willing to do the voluntary roadside test, the standardized field sobriety tests. And that's the basic three that most officers are all certified in. And that those SFSTs show us whether they're impaired or not. And that's what the DUI is when you're driving under the influence. In the state of Colorado, The way our statute reads is you're driving under the influence of drugs or alcohol or both. So it can be one, the other, or a combination of. So if they're sober, then back in the car they go. If they're impaired, then there's a process, and that would lead to an arrest context for driving under the influence. And then if it's not a D.R.E, that SFST officer can call a D.R.E in to come and do an evaluation, because oftentimes people aren't just on one substance. They might be on marijuana and something else. And if if the marijuana is the dominant drug, it's the primary drug at the time, there might be something else that's still in the system working against it as well, to make them even more unsafe.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, so I had a follow-up question.
Sure.
Earlier, you were saying that it took between 45 minutes to an hour, I think you said, to evaluate.
Mhm.
Is that all roadside, or is that something that is split between roadside and, say, a hospital for blood tests or so on?
That's a great question. So the arrest comes from the SFSTs on the side of the road, the evaluation by the arresting officer. The drug recognition evaluation is the one that takes 45 minutes to an hour, is typically done in a normal environment, an inside. It can be done at the hospital in the DUI room. It can be I've done them many times in my office here, where we just sit down and have a conversation with the subject. And that's kind of the way it starts. There's 12 steps throughout that process. And we, at the very beginning of it, the very first thing is a breath alcohol test to determine if there's a low amount of alcohol and there's still a great amount of impairment, what's the alcohol level? So if they only had one beer, but they smoked a joint as well, we want to know where their alcohol level of impairment is. Then there's the interview of the arresting officer. So I would ask the arresting officer what they were stopped for. Did the light turn green and sat there and stared at it? That'd be good to know, right? Then there's a preliminary examination, and that's kind of some medical questions to understand what medical issues they might be having, because there's an approach in the evaluation, because sometimes there are medical situations that mimic drug impairment. So we want to delineate that. And if it is medical impairment, oftentimes we've called medical out to come evaluate them. They're like, oh, this person's having a heart attack. He's not impaired. Or this person is having a diabetic episode or something. There are stories around the U.S. about D.R.Es literally saving people's lives because they're medically impaired, but the arresting officer just saw the impairment, right? And oftentimes when we ask people, how much have you had to drink or how much have you had to smoke, the answer is nothing. I haven't had anything. But if they appear messed up, then we go through that evaluation. So back into the 12-step part of it, then there's the eye exams, and then we do the divided attention tests, which are a lot like, and they're very similar to what's done on the side of the road with the walk and turn and one leg stand, but we also add the modified Romberg balance test and the finger to nose. And then we check all their vital signs. We're doing blood pressure, body temperature, and their pulse 3 different times throughout it, because some drugs elevate, bring things up. Some drugs bring them down. Some drugs do nothing to those but leave them alone. And then we do a darkroom examination where we measure their pupils in no light, near light, and direct light. We also look for signs of ingestion in the darkroom in their mouth and in the nasal cavity, because some drugs are, as we call it, insulflated. They're snorted. And we can see that as well. We check for muscle tone, because some drugs can make people flaccid, their muscles just really loose and just burr. And then some drugs that stimulate the body will make them just really, really rigid. And it's like moving a board when you have their arm. And then we ask them questions about their drug use and their statements and other observations. And then the 11th step is the opinion of the evaluator of what drug category or categories, or if it's a rule out. And often, sometimes it is a rule out. And then the 12th step is the toxicology examination, which is the blood test. And all drugs in the state of Colorado are done by blood test, except for alcohol. We have the option of blood or breath. Does that kind of give you an overview of the 12-step evaluation?
It does. And I thought of one more when you said that. Real quick, what happens if you refuse to take a blood test, if you've been brought in and you refuse the blood test?
In the state of Colorado, if a driver refuses a blood test on a first offense, their driving privilege is revoked for a year.
If they test positive or regardless?
If they refuse to take the test. In the state of Colorado, if they're
Oh, okay. Obviously they don't test positive.
Well, if they have more than if they have a 0.08 or more of alcohol, their driver's license is revoked then for excessive alcohol. But if they have an excessive amount of, let's say, cannabis or heroin or cocaine in their system, there is not currently revocation for that.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, I have one more question.
Yes,
if you could tell young people today one thing about marijuana and driving, what would that be?
So what one generation tolerates, the next generation accepts. So if we look at our parents and grandparents, it was their generations that fought the DUI driver with alcohol. If you look back into the 60s, it was, from the 60s to, I would say, the early 2000s, it was marijuana kind of tolerated, but we're into the next generation. And this generation, obviously, we voted it in. It's legal. So just because it's available and you can get your hands on it does not mean you should do it. If you have friends that are out there doing marijuana, you don't have to do it. You don't. It's your brain. It's your body. You only have one of each. Actually, you just have one because one's inside the other. So take care of your mind. Take care of your body and respect it. Because if you respect your body, it's going to respect you back and it'll give you a long, healthy life. As far as marijuana and driving, do not combine it. It's the chances of getting into a crash and getting yourself hurt or killed are way too great. When somebody drives high, your risk of crashing doubles. The higher you are, those numbers just go up until something extremely bad happens. I've stood in way too many parents' living rooms telling them that their young person's not coming home because of a bad choice. And those conversations are awful. So 1, don't do that to yourself. 2, don't put your family through that. Nobody needs that. If your friend has been smoking marijuana and is behind the wheel, do the same thing that you would do if they were drunk. Get the keys away from them. Tell them not to. Call them a cab. Call somebody. If you call a law enforcement officer and say, hey, listen, this is the choice that we're up against. My friend is driving high, or would you mind taking him home safely? I would come to your house every day, or I would come to that scene every day and drive you home rather than covering a fatal crash. It's not worth the risk. It is just not. So be honest with yourself when you get behind the wheel. Should I be driving? Evaluate yourself. Think about it in the context of when you're sick and you don't feel good. You know that things aren't right in your body. You've got a temperature. You're kind of disoriented. Who wants to drive feeling like that, right? When people feel so bad, typically they're going to call an ambulance to go to the hospital rather than drive themselves. So just be honest with yourself. That's I think the biggest thing. And just know that just because it's available, just because it's in your school, doesn't mean you have to either.
Corporal Hazlett, thank you so much for being with us today. This is a really important message for young and older drivers alike. So thank you for all you are doing to educate your fellow officers as well as the public and in keeping everyone safer on the road.
You're very welcome, Carrie. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Of course. So everybody else, join us next week when we will go live on Facebook with Louisiana and Wyoming SADD, and they will be addressing, or we all will be addressing, speak up to slow down. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.